After a successful Chernobyl week, it's time to once more bring this channel to a screeching halt with the penultimate, or it later turned out, not so penultimate, installment of our soporific reading and discussion of the obscure 1990 article published in the local Vestnik Chernobylya, written by Chernobyl liquidation veterans and nuclear power plant workers. First, let's address a point of methodology. Some of our viewers are complaining about the style of videos where we rely on and showcase text, as well as specify the sources of text we show. One possible leader of tomorrow summed our efforts as, "But your entire narrative approach seems to be reading things, a small number of, people said, and expecting the narrative you're trying to sell magically appearing out of thin air. It's a lot of spice, but I can't find the steak." Apparently our reliance on actual substance equates to selling magical spices appearing out of thin air. Sans the steak. This is called irony, as well as the fact that what actually stands out to this person is the single baseball analogy in the entire video, along with whatever the some shit referenced actually is. This attitude is not unpopular, as these types of videos have been some of the lowest performing. So, why do we sometimes refrain from being like other more successful YouTubers? Not throw some pictures and shit at you, and not just talk at you. It has been proven countless times that saying false things in YouTube videos is no obstacle to success, especially when there's a relatively engaging visual presentation and some personality to, for whatever reason, trust. Let us show you exactly why in the form of another comment. This is a person who claims to be a senior nuclear engineer with 15 plus years of experience in a, with capital letters to make sure they got their point across, real, as opposed to a simulation, we suppose, nuclear power plant. Now, we have no idea whether this person is what they claim they are. Why not believe them? If we were your average successful YouTubers, when push came to shove, we would back down and ignore the matter when an actual authority figure has possibly shown up. But we're not your average successful YouTubers, and we doggedly make series of videos that don't do well going over the stuff we literally read ourselves. Ultimately, that's where the substance, the steak, lies. Fools want and trust people to talk at them. We show you what we talk, so that not only can you associate the talk with people who are real nuclear power plant workers, but so that you can see the specific words. Specific words, as our experience has amply demonstrated, are of critical importance. Hide your kids, hide your wife. We may be really dumb, but we're forcing ourselves upon your feed anyway. Up to this point, anchored by the article written by real Chernobyl nuclear power plant workers, rather than anonymous ignorant YouTube commenters, we have reviewed the two literal causes of the Chernobyl disaster: the positive scram effect, or the reactor having a shutdown button acting as a power-up button, kind of like modern-day computers, except the buttons on modern-day computers know when they're supposed to be shutting down, rather than powering up the machine, and your house doesn't explode in the process into a smouldering disaster site that can give people cancer hundreds of kilometers away. And the positive power coefficient of reactivity, or the reactor having a property of self-acceleration so dangerous that the Soviets had a design not to be confused with Operation Rule against this very thing that they lied about. After exploring the nature of these two monstrous design flaws, we turned our attention to the deliberate deflection of blame from Soviet nuclear power experts who controlled the Chernobyl narrative to the Chernobyl Reactor 4 operators who were injured, killed, jailed, and thwarted in defending themselves. The false narrative Soviet nuclear power experts crafted to blame the operators and to protect themselves is highly conveniently distilled in mere 2 pages in their report to the Vienna meeting of 1986. They state their thesis plainly and clearly, explicitly defending themselves in writing that the actions of the operators were so unthinkable, they just couldn't think of designing completely foolproof protective safety systems against them. Soviet experts highlighted the 6 most dangerous violations of the operating rules, constituting the unthinkable actions of the operators leading to the destruction of the RBMK reactor, while not providing the operating rules for reference. We, along with the article authors who once again worked not only at a real nuclear power plant, but at the one and only real Chernobyl nuclear power plant, focus on these violation allegations. Up to this point, we have gone over half of them, those that were deviations from the rules. The remaining 3 allegations share a theme in that they explicitly concern protection safety systems that the operators supposedly went out of their way to disable, stripping the reactor of automatic protection. Let's see what Soviet devil lies in the details here. The 4th violation allegation levied against the Chernobyl operators by Soviet nuclear power experts was blocking the protection of the reactor at the signal of the shutdown of 2 TGs. The turbine generators were the turbines spun by steam coming out of the reactor core that converted mechanical energy into electricity. There was a protection system to automatically shut the reactor down if both turbines were shut down or disconnected. One turbine already having been shut down midday on the 25th of April 1986, that being TG number 7, leaving only TG number 8 connected to the reactor core of Unit 4. So, what's the catch? The article authors, who, let's not forget, were real workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and not only real workers at the Chernobyl NPP at any point in time, but at the time it went boom, and thereafter, cite operating regulations. The cited regulations state that when the electric load on both turbo generators is reduced to 100 megawatts or less, electric load being about a 1:3 ratio to thermal power, not only could the operators withdraw the automatic reactor shutdown on disconnection of both turbo generators, but they apparently must do that. The must word is significant to emphasize, as it supports a statement in INSAG 7 we had heretofore found bizarre. So, let's turn to the INSAG 7 report, the number one source on the causes of Chernobyl bearing the Expert International Atomic Energy Agency mark. You know, written by real nuclear engineers and such, even with more than 15 years of experience at presumably real nuclear power plants, institutes, and some shit. Like, for real. For real, for real. Here we have a pithy paragraph on the matter of this protection system being disabled on page 76 of the report. We start with something quite interesting that the article we're following doesn't touch on. You see how the disconnection of TG number 8 is timed at 41 minutes past midnight on the 26th of April 1986, followed by a whopping 4 operating logs documenting this specific timing. Remember this detail because we'll be coming back to it. The operators had, in essence, not 1 but 2 rundown tests to perform on TG number 8. One that Soviet experts mention, and another one that they were aware of, but seem to have had forgotten to mention. The latter less known one is the completion of a turbine vibration measurements program associated with a famous red Mercedes truck. In order for both of these tasks to be completed, on the one remaining running turbine, the operators had to disable the automatic reactor trip on disconnection of it. To quote the report, the personnel did this in accordance with Section 1 of the Procedures for Reswitching Keys and Straps of the Engineered Protection and Blocking Systems, which provided for the disabling of this protection system in the event of a turbogenerator load of less than 100 megawatts electricity. The Commission believes that the personnel cannot be blamed for disabling the reactor protection system, which shuts down the reactor in the event of the closure of the emergency stop valves of both turbines. Turning to page 18, we find the wording that had previously confused us. Disabling of the two-turbine trip was allowed, and indeed was required by normal procedures at low power levels, such as the power level for the revised test. So, indeed, not only was the disabling of the automatic protection system allowed, but it was actually required by the operating instructions. But the following sentence is just as curious. In any event, the occurrence of this trip might well have caused the destruction of the reactor at the time of the turbine trip rather than shortly afterwards. This statement in INSAG 7 is reflected in the article as well. The likely outcome of a shutdown before the test was the same as shutting the reactor down 36 seconds later. The test itself was actually not very significant. Why is the test not remembered as such? Well, because Soviet propaganda succeeded in shaping the narrative. In 1986, among virtually everything else, Soviet experts were trying to conceal the positive scram effect. As you can see in the INSAG 1 timeline, the first International Atomic Energy Agency report on the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, there is a statement that the automatic trip would have saved the reactor. Notice when, according to this report, the protection system was disabled. 1:23:04. Remember how, in Donald Trump's stable genius weave-making super high IQ fashion, we mentioned the amply documented actual timing of the disabling of this trip, like 90 seconds ago, and are connecting it to what we're talking about now. 2024 NRA speech moment of infamy. Yeah, so, not only was the validity and the significance of the disabling of the reactor trip lied about, but even the timing itself was lied about. Why lie about every single aspect of the disabling of the two turbogenerator disconnection trip? This information may have been new to the international authors of INSAG 7, but it sure as hell wasn't new to the Soviet experts, who analysed the causes of the disaster and prepared the narrative of them. Hell, there's a poignant passage in Adam Higginbotham's book about how a suffering Valery Legasov was meticulously preparing the report to the Vienna meeting himself to tell most of the truth. Likewise, in serial Harvard book writer Serhii Plokhy's book, Legasov is portrayed as the one truth-teller. How did Valery Legasov miss all of this? He didn't, of course. Legasov was a professional. He was a powerful Soviet man in a position of leadership at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, one of the leading culprits of the Chernobyl disaster. Here's a 2019 interview with nuclear physicist Alexander Borovoy, whose credentials you can see here. Borovoy balks at the HBO miniseries' portrayal of Legasov as a heroic fighter against the regime. Borovoy states, I repeat, he was a Soviet man, not a dissident. They made Valery Alexievich some kind of nervous, eccentric type. This is not about him. The stereotypical meek scientist opposed to an authoritarian government was not Valery Legasov. Valery Legasov was a Soviet, a communist, and a leader. And what does a man like that do? The interviewer asks if Legasov actually saved the Soviet, and subsequently Russian, nuclear power industry. Borovoy goes on to tell a personal story Legasov swore him to secrecy over. Borovoy notes neither Legasov nor the Soviet Union are around, so might as well spill the beans. Legasov showed Borovoy a sheet with a detailed scenario of what should happen at the International Atomic Energy Agency. The paramount concern was that, quote, they were going to raze us to the ground. The Soviets feared that if they gave an impression of obscuring, hiding the truth, the result would be a demand for all RBMK reactors to be closed, for reparations to be paid to all countries over which the radioactive cloud passed, with presumably an enforcement element from the IAEA. Borovoy was horrified by what he read, whereas Legasov cheerfully said, "We must fight." Borovoy had no idea what could be done, but the cleverer Legasov was clearly tickled by the challenge before him. This angle of the Chernobyl disaster is marked in Politburo session notes. Notice the unmistakable similarities between what Borovoy is stating with respect to Legasov and what Soviet leader Gorbachev was seemingly candidly saying in the Politburo, the seat of Soviet government. Quote, we suffered huge losses, not only economic, not only human. The political damage is great. Now people are doubting whether our energy program is at an adequate level. They are throwing in the idea about discrediting the USSR, Soviet science, technology, alleging that our nuclear energy industry is deformed. Then Gorbachev begins to extol telling the truth. They owed it to the world. Their work was in full view of the people of the world, as well as of their own, and it was impermissible to try getting away with half measures and tricky solutions. Quote, we need to provide full information about what happened. Legasov, like Gorbachev, would wield the truth as a weapon, at least in the apparent impression of those who relay their words and actions to us. In his interview, Borovoy states how Legasov went about things in the manner of Gorbachev's words. First, Legasov did not prepare a short report, but 2 entire volumes. Legasov was such a virtuous renegade that the Ministry of Machine Building wanted him jailed, but Legasov went to Prime Minister Ryzhkov to convince him that he was right, which he did, as apparently he got a blank check. Do as you see fit, I will cover you. At this point, we ask all of you audio freaks to pause the video and read what is shown on your screen. This is page 60 of the book Chernobyl Past, Present and Future, where the note-taker of the task force of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee is recalling his memories. Now, there's a pregnant squint in the direction of Prime Minister Ryzhkov on the part of Valery Legasov. In his interview, Borovoy recalls that as a result of Legasov's voluble narrative and information dump, quote, the enemy scenario was broken. The report lasted 5 hours. There were 3 screens, a dancing bear, formulas and drawings, photo slides and videos taken at the station by our guys at the risk of their lives. After Legasov's speech, the useful idiots assembled, stood up and applauded for a couple minutes, cheering on the people who blew up Chernobyl. Quote, what conclusion did the IAEA make? The fault lies mainly with the operators who drove the reactor into an uncontrollable situation. And most importantly, our measures to improve the safety of RBMK were recognized as effective. Here's some more irony. A quote from a 1994 book from the American Center for Strategic and International Studies. One senior scientific colleague from the Kurchatov Institute wrote, not anonymously, that Legasov was a clear representative of that scientific mafia whose political leanings, instead of scientific leadership, led to the Chernobyl accident. The author characterizes this statement from a senior physicist at the Kurchatov Institute as nothing more than an act of professional jealousy. That is how you become a master of weaponized narration. They say people roll over in their graves. Valery Legasov should take a bow. Here is what Soviet experts led by Valery Legasov did. They took an amply documented event and pushed back its timing 40 minutes. The operating logs were primary information not made publicly available. From what we can tell, Soviet experts never mentioned the turbine vibration measurements task, which undermined their narrative, as it explained why the operators deviated from the 700 megawatt power figure the operators themselves wrote in their own testing program, and why they disabled the 2-turbogenerator disconnection reactor trip, all in accordance with operating regulations. Soviet experts moved the disabling of the trip to 123.04, or to the beginning of the rundown test they did mention, and the significance of which they exaggerated, to create an image of redundant protection. Soviet experts failed to create a reactor following the actual defense in depth principle written in INSAG 1. So they made up their own defense in depth set of, let us call them alternative facts, their own Swiss cheese stack. They placed this valid, even required disabling of a trip at the beginning of the test to make it look like yet another obstacle placed in the path of the operators by the reactor designers to prevent a disaster, a final obstacle. They claimed this trip would have saved the reactor. But that was when they also weren't forthcoming about the positive scram effect. Hence the quote. In the light of new information regarding positive scram, the statement made under the significance column of Table 1 in INSAG 1 that this trip would have saved the reactor seems not to be valid. Even when looking at just one violation allegation against the operators, we encounter multiple highly significant lies. How clever. But cleverness was in the DNA of these people. Our Kurchatov Institute viewer left a comment under the Prometheus video that connects to a few quotes we've encountered in other sources. In his direct experience, people at the Kurchatov Institute pretended they knew everything, like gods. Our viewer is not the only one who came away with such an impression. None other than Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev is recorded in Politburo notes as stating the following. We have been hearing from you, scientists, specialist ministers, that everything is under control here, and you expect us to look up to you as if you were gods. This is where it all started, because the ministries and all the scientific centres got out of control, and it all ended in failure. And even now I do not see that you are contemplating any conclusions. You are all just stating facts, or even trying to smooth over some of them. Notice how in the following line, Gorbachev nonetheless affirms the main point of the experts. The operators are to blame. To what extent even Gorbachev was deceived at the beginning of July 1986, we do not know. Here is another quote on page 174 of Chernobyl Past, Present and Future, written by the Chernobyl Task Force note-taking member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Georgy Kopchinsky, and the chairman of the commission that wrote Annex 1 of INSAG 7, Nikolai Steinberg. Moreover, its designers failed to fulfill a large number of the regulatory requirements. Any RBMK criticism was suppressed by a powerful presence of Minsredmash, Ministry of Medium Machine Building. The merits of this ministry especially in the military sphere, the nuclear shield creation, are indisputable. Undoubtedly, the intellectual elite of the country, prominent scientists and specialists, were gathered in it. But to turn it into a state within a state, actually deprive of control, put a toga of infallible oracles on its leaders, was the largest mistake of the country's leadership, which led to the tragic consequences. The untouchable superhumans, under the umbrella of the humbly named Ministry of Media Machine Building, are noted for their transcendence in Adam Higginbotham's Midnight in Chernobyl as well, on page 276, revealing to the world the true roots of the disaster, the design of the reactor itself, the systematic, long-term failures, and the culture of secrecy and denial of the Soviet nuclear program, and the arrogance of the senior scientist overseeing its implementation was unthinkable. If the report acknowledged the design flaws of the RBMK reactor, responsibility for the accident could be traced all the way up to the chief designer and the chairman of the Academy of Sciences. In a society where the cult of science had supplanted religion, the nuclear chiefs were among its most sanctified icons, pillars of the Soviet state. To permit them to be pulled down would undermine the integrity of the entire system on which the USSR was built. They could not be found guilty. What Higginbotham didn't place enough weight on is that Valery Legasov was the protege of Anatoly Alexandrov, the director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy and president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Legasov himself was deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute and vice president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. When people try to express the truth of Chernobyl, they overlook the number one thing about it: the operational details. This willful ignorance that is the product of fundamentally flawed research, whether professionally or on social media platforms like this one, often spares one of the foremost liars of Chernobyl, Valery Legasov. Legasov didn't merely leave a part of the truth out, he spun it on its head, cheerfully so. Those satanic parades may have rubbed off on him. There are a couple more stereotypes to spin on their heads. As most impressively shown in the HBO miniseries on the disaster, well, it's a little complicated. Idiots on the political right tend to be more, let's call it, skeptical of science, particularly when they dislike the implications. Whereas idiots on the political left sort of like the idea of science. But, generally speaking, all manners of idiots are in agreement that the Soviet government was terrible. The politically left creator of the HBO miniseries cast the Soviet system as the ultimate villain, and Soviet scientists as sort of oppressed heroes. To use a stupid expression from when Game of Thrones was around, our Kurchatov Institute viewer seems to subvert such expectations. In addition to the arrogance of Soviet scientists that probably has many analogues in present days, he claims that specialists commonly falsified their reports to the Soviet government to prove that they did their job safely, and presumably to stave off government interference with their work. And so, when the gods of Chernobyl had their moment of comeuppance, when the nuclear reactor they created, oversaw, and updated blew up because of all things its shutdown button was pressed, they resorted to doing what other gods, their peers, would do in some mythologies. They got clever and not very moral. Change a timing here, don't mention an operating detail there, just plain lie about the significance of something, and dump a bunch of information, formulas, and pictures to ironic applause. It makes for a tale.